Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today, I bring you a special bonus episode for Valentine's Day. And since I love all of my followers, and what better subject to cover on Valentine's Day than a French language adaptation of Agatha Christie? French is the language of love, after all. I will be reviewing Season 2 of Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie and my terrible French accent, which I watched on Amazon Prime. I'm not really sure where else you can watch this, but I highly recommend it. Like Season 1, Season 2 took the framework from some of Christie's stories and placed them in an entirely new setting. These are not direct adaptations. These are inspired by, and the series does a very good job of this. Even the times where I didn't like some of the changes, the show still works on its own. The show is intentionally campy, but it's a restrained campy, and it understands the original material very well. All 27 episodes are very watchable, entertaining. There's not a truly awful episode in the bunch. And I will say, I loved Season 2. I think Season 1, which had entirely different cast, was probably a hair better quality-wise, but I found myself having a lot more fun with and having a lot more affection for Season 2 and its cast. I was sad when it's over. And it's not like Season 2 didn't deliver quality-wise, because it absolutely did. But I did feel like there were a few episodes that didn't, quite cut it for me. Season 2 is really 4 seasons of the show. It gets a little confusing. This aired over the course of 7 years, from 2013 to 2020, I'm sorry. In English, this block of episodes is called Agatha Christie's Criminal Games and is set in the late 1950s to early 1960s in Lille in northern France. And I'll go through the characters in every episode. I'll let you know what I think. And there aren't a lot of spoilers, but there are 1 or 2 episodes I do spoil just because I want to talk about some of the changes that were made and that did require a spoiler. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And once again, I do apologize for my poor French. I do actually understand and can read French. I did take French in college, but, it's been a while, so, pronunciation might not be the greatest anymore as it once was, but I promise you I was an A student in French 1 and French 2 when I was in college 10 to 12 years ago. We have 3 lead characters this season instead of 2. The first is Commissaire Swan Laurence, played expertly by Samuel Labarthe. He is a police detective. The English uses the title inspector, but I believe he's a little more senior than that. And, Laurence is rude. He doesn't like to be bothered. He's a womanizer. And when the season begins, he's new to Lille, having relocated from Paris. He is considered the best detective in France, or one of the best detectives in France. And I know a lot of people will say he's Poirot-coded. I don't really get Poirot from Laurence. Who I do get is Inspector Slack from the Miss Marple series, especially in the way he dismisses Elise Avril. I'll get to her shortly. And he does not like outside help. And you can pretty much guarantee over the course of each of these 90-minute episodes, he's going to arrest pretty much every character who appears, and often Elise herself. He undergoes a lot of character development over the course of the series. He experiences love and loss, and it softens him noticeably, but not entirely, where he feels like a totally different person. He becomes a little less chauvinistic and a touch friendlier, and this development is motivated by events that happen to him in some of these episodes. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. And I would say out of the 3 main leads, Laurence is the most serious, least campy of them all, but he has his moments as well. Our second lead is Elise Avril, played by Blandine Bellavoir, who also appeared in the first season, though she was not Elise there. She was Albertine, who was the Rosaline Claude parallel character in the Taken at the Flood episode. And she is initially a gossip columnist at La Voix du Nord newspaper. Her name there is Marie Chantal. I got a lot of tawdry Dear Abby from this. And she eventually gets promoted to a reporter, but because she's very good at her job and she likes sneaking in on Laurence's crime scenes, much to his annoyance. And she's had a rough past. I mean, she grew up in an orphanage, and at a very young age, she married a man, we'll meet him, whom she later walked out on because he was terrible. Although she is still legally married to him. I don't believe she's ever officially divorced, though he is often referred to as her ex-husband, but I don't think they're actually divorced. And Elise is often short of money. You know, she's underpaid, she's underappreciated. She can never get the respect she craves and deserves because her superiors at the newspaper are extremely chauvinistic men, as is Swan Laurence. She's scrappy, though, and she often goes undercover, either purposely or accidentally so, and she's often sent to play either the help, or on several occasions she becomes an actress or a singer, and apparently very famous as well. It happens multiple times. She's in a lot of ways Miss Marple, not in personality wise, but in the way she can never get the credit for all of her work and how much she's underestimated and underappreciated. If season one had the relationship between La Rosière and Lampion be a little bit of the Poirot Hastings, the relationship between Elise and Laurence is a lot like the one between Miss Marple and Inspector Slack. You know, she often fills in for the female leads for the novels. She replaces, like Egg in the 3-act tragedy episode, Bridget in the Murder is Easy episode, and Bedingfeld in The Man in the Brown Suit. And you can really see with Elise and her character that the producers and the writers of the show really understand Christie's original works, especially Miss Marple. They took that sort of subtle shrewdness from Miss Marple and in the way she's underappreciated and put her into Elise. And you really get that, yeah, they understand the original works here. Our final lead is Marlene Leroy, played by Élodie Frenck. Marlene is Laurence's secretary, and she is not like Miss Lemon at all. She's not the best at secretarial work, but she is competent. You know, she's not a bad secretary, but hardly the efficient Miss Lemon. Marlene is very glamorous and elegant. She's madly in love with Laurence. She has a shrine to him in her home, which is really funny. Laurence loves Marlene, but as a friend, not a lover. He has an appreciation for her that's not romantic. You know, and all of the other men in these episodes, especially the men she works with, all love Marlene. And she's obsessed with celebrities and the gossip. She's very Marilyn Monroe-like, and not just in appearance either. And she becomes good friends with Elise, but her true best friend is a goldfish named Boubou, who dies multiple times and is secretly replaced by Laurence, so she won't get upset. And Marlene isn't quite like the stereotypical dumb blonde, although she has her moments there. And she sometimes gets drawn in and distracted by like the flashy celebrity status of some of the suspects, or if like a suspect has like a particular like dramatic love story, she's just like instantly on their side. She sometimes dates some of the men who are suspects, and she's often abandoning her job and running off to become like a model or a spokesperson. She has a habit of revealing confidential information, often to Elise, that Laurence doesn't want her to know, but she sometimes does this to actual suspects as well. And I really liked Marlene as a character. I thought she showed surprising depth of character, although she is primarily comic relief, but I mean, she's much more than that as well. And that was the main cast. And now for the supporting cast, which becomes more prominent as the series goes on. The cast gets expanded, and the only other character to appear in all 27 episodes is Ernest Tricard, played by Dominique Thomas, who's the superintendent of the police station. Initially, he's really a jerk, but he mellows out very quickly, and he's not a particularly great investigator, and is rarely seen, like, actually investigating, unless there's someone, like, very important involved. He's kind of dumb, but usually comes in to save the day when he needs to. Like, he can be counted on and is reliable. And he's in love with Marlene, because of course he is. And he's a widower and becomes an alcoholic. And then later on in the series, he finds, like, a surprising love interest, actually, that really came out of nowhere to me. But I thought it was all in good fun. Next, we have the first medical examiner, Dr. Euphrasie Malloy, played by Natasha Lindinger, and she's a militant feminist. She is the exact opposite of Laurence, so naturally they fall hard for each other. Dr. Malloy is only in a handful of episodes, but she leaves a lasting impact on Laurence. They had this odd relationship because they want to get together, but they have nothing in common, and Marlene is trying to split them up constantly. And I have this theory, actually, that Marlene is responsible for Dr. Malloy's death, as Marlene does visit the Pale Horse in one episode and is warned that Euphrasie stands between her and Laurence. But Dr. Malloy dies in a plane crash, and it leaves Laurence absolutely heartbroken. The second medical examiner, technically he's the third, the second one's not important. The third medical examiner is Dr. Timothy Glissant, played by Cyril Gueï, and he appears about halfway through the season, and he's there for a good time. I really like Glissant. He was totally unserious, especially for like what you would expect for a medical examiner. And he was always just having fun and brightening everyone's day. He has a crush on Marlene as well. He's someone who is a lot friendlier than what you would expect from a medical examiner. And he like listens to rock music all the time, and he's like really never focused on like on the dead body that's on his slab or when he goes to the crime scene. He's a bit like Marlene in that he's not always like 100% focused on the job at hand, but I liked him. I thought he was a lot of fun. Next, we have Arlette Carmoui, played by Marie Berthaud, and she was only in the last like handful of episodes, but boy, did she enter with a bang. I mean, she's initially a replacement for Marlene when Marlene was going to get married, but then became a police officer when Marlene returned. And she's loud and clumsy, very much the opposite of Marlene, and she hates Laurence. And it's not unjustified since Laurence insults her pretty brutally here. I actually thought at one point she was being set up as like this sort of villainous character across several episodes, but that didn't happen. And Carmoui was a pretty fun character and a surprisingly sympathetic one. Like, you love her one minute, you feel for her, and the next minute you absolutely hate her. But you do wind up loving her in the end. We have Flic Martin, played by Eric Beauchamp, and he's a police officer who does like most of like the routine police work and puts the handcuffs on pretty much everyone because Laurence is always arresting everyone. And Flic is not his first name. That's like a title for cops in France. He often like doesn't get a lot to do, but he's sort of like always there. I mean, he doesn't appear to be too bright, but I thought he was worth mentioning at least. And the final character is Robert Jodoui, played primarily by Francois Godard, but also by Christophe Piret for like an episode or two. And he is Alice's boss at La Voix du Nord, and he's a jerk. He's much more of a jerk than Laurence is, but most episodes begin with him firing Alice or sidelining her or giving her like some task that's just like undesirable. Typically, he doesn't play any role in the actual plot of the episode. He's merely a jerk who tells Alice to go out and do something, and that's when she finds like these dead bodies all the time and these other crime scenes and winds up like tracking down Laurence. It would have been nice if he got like a comeuppance at some point, but he never does. He just sort of like written out. He doesn't even get like in the last episode, which is just like a send off for the series. He doesn't even, I don't even think he appears in that at all. He doesn't get like a big musical dance number like everyone else does. All right, let's get into the episodes. The premiere episode of season 2 was called Jeu de Glace, or Game of Mirrors. This is an adaptation of They Do It With Mirrors, and I have to be honest, I thought this one was fine. Like, the series did not start out with like a huge bang for me, like a real hit. It wasn't to the point where I was getting nervous that season 2 wasn't going to be good after coming off the very strong season 1. I did expect to like this one more, but I really enjoyed the new characters here. I think this was a very strong introduction for Commissaire Laurence and Alice Avril. I thought Marlene took like a couple of episodes to become really into her own, but it was really the characters that elevated this episode. And to be fair, the mystery lacks because it lacks in the book as well. There just like isn't a lot going on here, and I think this is perfect to fit in these introductions. And I did like Alice here, who basically became like Lucy Islesborough, but since this isn't 450 from Paddington, she basically takes over the Jolie Belliver role. There are a few changes to the plot here. I didn't feel any of them were really necessary, but none of them hurt or helped the plot in any way. I mean, the prisoners are all pretty much have mental health problems, and I think they're older than what they were in the book. As always with the adaptations of this novel, the late book murder is changed considerably. The victim is now Leonard, who is the adaptation equivalent of Edgar Lawson. I thought the Mildred Street parallel, her name is Jacqueline, was very well done. She's played by Sylvie Maupu, and I thought she was like a really good actress for this role. Jacqueline is somehow even a worse person in this version than in the book, and I found her very compelling. She actually lost all of her money here because she was trying to impress her cousin Pierre, whom she's in love with. Pierre is the Christian Gulbranson parallel, and I'm going to spoil both the ending of the novel and this adaptation, so I normally wouldn't do this, but I thought the ending was worth discussing here, so skip ahead to the next episode if you need to. I promise I'm not spoiling a lot in this video, but we have the same murderer and accomplice in the book. The murderer is Louis Sericold. His name is Etienne, and Leonard is still the sort of unwilling accomplice, but there is a new accomplice who is very willing, and that is Marie Rose, who is the Carrie Louise character, and this was, I thought, an interesting choice. And what the show did was they had Etienne confess to Marie Rose about the embezzlement, and she helped cover it up because she loved Etienne. And I think there is a little bit of a textual basis for this. In the novel, Carrie Louise really did love Louis and was sort of at peace with what he did. She never felt betrayed. And I found that interesting they made her the murderer here. Again, I thought it was an interesting choice and one that I think paid off pretty well. The second episode is Morte au Champagne, Champagne of Death, or as we know it, Sparkling Cyanide. And I wasn't overly thrilled with this episode either. Again, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't really wowing me. And the plot is largely faithful to the novel, but a lot of the backstory changed. Rosemary, who is now named Elvire, she's an actress. The Faradays are now the Hartmans, and Monsieur Hartman is a film producer, and his wife is the screenwriter. And I think this might actually be the best adaptation of Sparkling Cyanide, which has quite a few stinkers, if I'm being honest. I think this version does the best job of playing off the Rosemary means remembrance theme of the novel, which is weird because her name is not Rosemary anymore, it's Elvire. But you do get a lot of people thinking about Elvire throughout the episode, and I personally enjoyed Elise here. Elise somehow got cast in Elvire's role after she got murdered, and it's Elise who plays that actress at the second dinner party. And the show does a very good job of finding roles for the original characters and fitting them in without having to rearrange the whole story. It's very smooth. And I've criticized this mystery plot a bit, and this adaptation fixes a lot of what was wrong with it. In particular, the second murder, the one of George Barton, who is still George here. We actually have the murderer try to stop him from drinking the poison since they realize that George is in the wrong seat, which is something I have always been bothered by. How do these people not know they're sitting in the wrong seat? But again, I was not super wowed with this episode. It was a great episode, but it wasn't one I was expecting for the beginning of the series to really knock me off my feet. The third episode was a Dumb Witness adaptation called Témoin Mouillé, and this was the first episode of the season that really impressed me. I was really knocked off my feet here. And this is another novel whose plot isn't the strongest, and this version made a number of changes that all improved on the original, in my opinion, except for one pretty big issue. I'll get there. But this version cleared up a lot of the faults with the novel. There was a very heavy focus on the supernatural in this one, much more so than in the novel, to the point where some of the horror and ghost story elements are going on here. This is very much sort of a spooky one. And that leads me to my big issue here, is that I liked the ghost and supernatural items here. The problem is the ghosts, mainly the ghost of Emile Longwy, that's Emily Arundel, provides Elise with actual clues and where to find them, which is breaking the rules of detective fiction. I was not too thrilled that happened, but otherwise, I thought this was a fantastic episode. It was excellent. It was very mysterious, funny, creative, and remained largely faithful to the original, even though a lot of the characters have somewhat different stories. This episode is a good example of how the series uses Christie's stories to influence their own. They're not really direct adaptations of Christie's work, but highly inspired by them. And we do have a new murder and a character, that of Daisy the maid. I suppose she's not really a new character, as there was a maid in the novel, but she wasn't murdered. But Daisy also sees the ghost of Emily, and Emily is a really terrible person in this version. I mean, pretty much all the characters are horrible people in this episode. It's implied Emily may have been in a lesbian relationship with Genevieve, who is the Miss Lawson parallel. And Genevieve Ronson is in a relationship with Alexina, who is like both the sister's trip in one. But Alexina is Swan Laurence's mother, and their dynamic was so much fun in this episode. It was so good. It was really the highlight for me. I mean, I could have done without the incestuous relationship between Charlotte and Louis, who are the Teresa and Charles parallel. I also thought the portrayal of Bella and George, who are Bella and Jacob Tanios, was not great. I mean, one of the main points of the book is that Jacob isn't this terrible person he's made out to be, and that is retained here, but they really made him just so awful on the screen that it was harder to believe he wasn't really that bad. But overall, this was a fantastic episode. I thought it was the best of the first three. The next episode is Pourquoi pas Martin, or Why Not Martin, which is an adaptation of Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And this was a very good episode. It was very faithful to the novel plot-wise. This might actually be the most faithful episode of the season, although events did unfold sort of like a little different in order, but in ways that made much more sense. Elise takes over the Frankie role, but she has also parts of Bobby's role as well. I mean, she's the one who finds the body, and she's the one who's poisoned. Swan takes over like the rest of Bobby's role. Marlene actually takes part in the mystery here. At least up until this point, she wasn't like actually involved in the mystery solving. But from this point forward, she would be, and she basically takes over the Badger role, which was really funny. But I really enjoyed the dynamics between all three of the recurring characters here. It was very good. Elise and Swan still at each other's throats, but they're forced to work together, and they work together very well. The interplay between them is so much fun without becoming like overly campy. The plot overall is largely the same. I mean, some things happen in a different order, and there's more attention given to the attempts on Frederick's life. Frederick is the young nephew, the one who's like the Tommy Bassington French equivalent, and the Henry Bassington French character, who is here named Andre Delavie, is not murdered. We do miss that on that fun murder, but again, this is only 90 minutes, so I did have to cut something. But I thought it was a very fun episode. I very much enjoyed it. The fifth episode is called Meurtre à la Kermesse, or Murder at the Fair, and this is an adaptation inspired by Halloween Party, although all the Halloween elements have been eliminated. Halloween was not a big deal in France in the late 1950s, and to be fair, it wasn't a big deal in the 1970s England when Christie wrote the novel, or the 1930s England when Poirot set their adaptation, but they went with the Halloween anyway. Instead, the murder takes place at a school fair, so there's still all these games and everything. Louise Ortega, that would be the Joyce Reynolds parallel, is murdered the same way. The plot is somewhat faithful to the original, but it's presented in a way I think that makes a lot more sense. A lot of the weirdness has been removed. Not all of it, but much of it. Louisa is probably about like 8, while Miranda is now like 16 or 17. Miranda is still named Miranda, and she has a whole new personality. There is no Judith Butler. Miranda's mother is now the Elizabeth Whitaker character. Rowena Drake is now Catherine Devignon, and she's the mayor of the town, and that makes sense. And there are some other changes. I mean, Laurence figures out pretty quickly the murder Louisa is said to have seen is the Olga Semenoff one. Olga is still Olga here. There's now no like Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe stuff. That's all gone. Michael Garfield is instead a sculptor named Javier Tremen, and he is having an affair with Miranda and pretty much everyone, including Elise. Inspector Laurence is temporarily blinded for most of this episode, which didn't really seem to serve any real purpose other than some comedic effect when Marlene has to drive him around. I really enjoyed this episode, but there were some like little hitches when you think about it, and there's some things that don't really make sense or work. The clue about the vase from the novel is retained, but I didn't feel like it worked in the context it was now used in. I don't know why Miranda told Louisa about the murder she saw. There's a new character named Monsieur Milieu who very clearly has mental health problems. He reminded me a lot of Alexander Bonaparte Cust, actually, and he was a character used very strangely, as was this other new character of Benoit, who I guess was supposed to be like Desmond Holland, but really nothing like him. There are just some like smaller plot points that didn't make sense or didn't really fit in, but the episode was still very good, but it's little hitches there here and there that bothered me. The next episode is Cartes sur table, or Cards on the Table, and this episode is miles better than the Suchet adaptation. I don't understand why this book, though, can't get like an adaptation that remains true to the spirit of the novel. I understand why they made these changes. This is still a very good episode. There's more than enough content to make it faithful, though. Now, most of the plot involving the four suspects remains the same. I found all four of those actors and those characters to be excellent here. They really captured the essence of those four. Dr. Barillon, who is the equivalent of Dr. Roberts, is supposed to have murdered his brother instead of his patient, but other than that, everything involving them is mostly the same. But the changes they made were just a little unnecessary to me. It changed the premise of the novel overall. I mean, the novel is a challenge Christie issued to herself to create this murder where there are only four suspects. Yet, in this adaptation, made Laurence and Alice suspects as well, which is really annoying because the viewers are going to know they didn't do it, and Laurence and Alice take the place of Poirot and Mrs. Oliver, while Alice also takes over a lot of like the Rhoda Dawes stuff. There is no Rhoda here. The other two detectives are Marlene, because of course, and a spy named Juve, who is pretty terrible and is also a suspect, though he winds up getting murdered later on. I mean, to me, this episode was very good on its own, and it was a good adaptation of Cards on the Table, but again, I'm just probably unnecessarily bothered how often how the series made other suspects besides the original four. But it's 1,000 times better than the Suchet episode. There's a good play on words here, as dummy in bridge is called le mort, or the dead in France. So that brings a lot of confusion and double talk, especially with Marlene, because she doesn't know how to play bridge, and neither do I, so very relatable. The four detectives have to play charades instead, and the bridge scores clue aren't really important here in this version, and that's like a pretty large part from the novel. I think there are times this adaptation didn't keep the spirit of the novel, but it was still a very good adaptation. It was very watchable. I loved it. The next episode is called Le Crime ne paie pas, Crime Doesn't Pay, which is an adaptation of Murder on the Links. And I found this one to be one of the weaker episodes of the season. It's still very watchable. It was still very entertaining. But there wasn't really a lot of murder on the links here. The basic murder plot and kidnapping plot is still there, but it seems like a bit of an afterthought at times, and didn't really get going about halfway into the episode. This episode has a slow start, and the setting has now been moved from the golf course to a cabaret club. Alice goes undercover as a waitress and then a singer at this club. This reminded me a lot of the season 1 episode of Body in the Library, which moved the action to a brothel, but I think that worked much better than this did. The plot mostly focuses on the investigation into Laurence for being a crooked cop. This is where the Giraud counterpart comes into play. His name is Monsieur Petitpont, which I believe means like Mr. Littlebridge, and he's kind of a creep. The Giraud of the novel was a moron, and that interplay is still here with Laurence never missing an opportunity to insult Petitpont. But Petitpont was so unlikable and a sludge ball. He's like constantly slobbering over Marlene, and he tries to kill Laurence at one point. He's not the harmless fool of the novel. And the murder plot is actually a little bit different, and we have an additional culprit here. The entire Baraldi kidnapping backstory is still present, but we don't learn about it until the very end. Now, I think the novel sort of like dumps that information all at once in a slog, so I think this is a little better, but it's still a little bad that like the episode wasn't upfront with this information. But this episode did solve some of the issues I have with the novel, but it also created new ones. And because the murder stuff didn't seem to be a top priority, I felt this to be like one of the weaker episodes. But again, still very watchable. It's not like you have to skip this one or everything. That's always the case here, where even if an episode does some like weird things, it's still a very good episode in its own right. The next episode is called Pension Vanillot, which is the French name of the novel Hickory Dickory Dock. And I really love this episode. I think this is one of the best episodes of the season. And I thought the performances from the three main leads were especially great here, especially Élodie Frenck, who plays dual roles here. She's Marlene, as always, but she also plays Marlene's sister Solange, who is the counterpart to Mrs. Hubbard. And she's actually a mesh of Mrs. Hubbard and Mrs. Nicoletis. With, quite frankly, she's more Mrs. Nicoletis because she's pretty awful. But this book improved so much on the novel and did away with what doesn't work while keeping the plot largely intact. We don't have that like horrible racial content. And unlike the Suchet episode, this episode did retain some of the foreign students. As usual, when the series changes certain plot points so they make more sense, this episode kept that plot pretty much intact, but presented events in a different order. Louise, who is the equivalent of Celia, is still the victim, but she dies in a different manner, and the motive for her killing is a little different. Laurence is onto a drug ring very early on, and he's been working with, oh yes, Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, who gets name dropped, though we don't see him. But there's a new victim in Mary Patterson, who is a totally new character. The plot basically opens the same, but Laurence isn't interested in helping Marlene's sister because he's too busy dealing with the drug ring, so Marlene appeals to Alice, who goes undercover at the hostel. I really enjoyed this episode. I thought it was fantastic. There are one or two little missteps again, but for one, the petty thefts are played down considerably, which is fine, but they still happen. But we're never given any real explanation as to why Louisa was doing this, because there's no Colin McNabb character to impress. It's never really explained, but again, that's a little bit of a knock here. But this was otherwise a fantastic episode. The next episode is the Murder is Easy adaptation called Un mort est el facile, and I don't know what it is with this book that we can't get a good version of this novel. To be fair, this episode is probably the best adaptation of this book, besides the radio adaptation, and it's not that great either. It's not bad. Again, none of these episodes are total flops, but this one was just really bizarre to me. The leads in Laurence, Marlene, and Alice were all off here, I thought, acting very uncharacteristically. It was a little strange, and the plot is also a little weird. There's no country village here. The action takes place mostly in a factory, and there are very few characters with novel counterparts. Alice takes over the Bridget role and is engaged to Emile Dubuc, who is the Gordon Whitfield character, because she's tired of being poor and he's rich, and he asked her to marry him, so she did, or she said yes. The murders are mostly all different. The Lavinia Pinkerton character, her name is Josiane Laline, still does her thing, but she says she's going to be the next victim, and she dies in the way that Tommy Pierce dies in the novel. But the plot here just didn't do it for me. There was a lot of things left unexplained and things that made no sense. I found the murderer here to be unsatisfying. A little bit of a spoiler here. It's the same character from the novel, but that character is so detached from what's going on at the factory here. It really made no sense. The motivation is the same, but some of the victims didn't really do anything against Emile, so they made unconvincing victims. This episode was weak. It's not that I hated it or anything. I thought it needed being tightened up, and again, probably the best version of Murder is Easy we have. The next episode is Mademoiselle McGinty est morte, or Mrs. McGinty's dead, and she's a miss here, not a Mrs. And like Mrs. McGinty, this episode was also a bit of a miss. The murder was such an afterthought in this one, and most of it surrounds Alice and her estranged husband Robert, who is played by Arnaud Perron, who is the real-life husband of Blandine Bellavoir. Robert is the James Bentley character, although he's actually quite different from James Bentley. But a lot of the characters from the novel were cut, and the ones who remained were significantly underutilized. The plot is basically the same. Miss McGinty has her throat slit here instead of being hit on the head. There's no village. Instead, everyone lives in an apartment owned by Miss McGinty. The stuff about the article with the women who kill is introduced much later than in the novel, and it's actually Alice who wrote the article, and Miss McGinty actually did mail in the letter to the newspaper. Marlene takes over a lot of what Mrs. Oliver did, but so much of this episode was dedicated to Alice and Robert that The actual investigation for me was very slight, and the one-time characters weren't developed at all or given a lot of screen time, including the murderer, so it didn't have like that big impact at the end. To me, this just didn't do it for me. The next episode is called Murder Party, and this was an adaptation of A Murder is Announced, and I did not like this episode either. This is the third episode in a row where I thought the product was getting a little not great, and I was starting to get a bit worried for the rest of the season. Luckily, it gets much better, but this episode has a lot of issues, and a lot of issues sort of unique to it. To be fair, much of the plot is faithful to the novel, but it cuts out a lot of the things that make A Murder is Announced special. I mean, the opening scene with the first murder, that of Rudy Schertz, who is here named Kurt Vengen, was terrible. There was way too much light in the room, and I'm not going to be spoiling the book and the episode a little bit here, but we get close-up shots of all the characters except the Miss Blacklock parallel named Letitia Salvant, and so it's like pretty obvious and noticeable what's going on here. A lot of the neighbors have been cut, except for Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd, named here Greenblatt and Harriet. Patrick and Edmund have been merged into one character, Marcel. There is no Mitzi. There's no, Easterbrooks, Mrs. Swetenham, Bunch. They're all gone. There are still lesbians and Greenblatt and Harriet, with Greenblatt also having a crush on Marlene. Some of the best clues from the book, including, the central heating and she wasn't there line are removed. I thought the bunny character named Odette was not used well. She's actually murdered before her birthday party, so that really took away a lot of the impact of her death and the whole scheme Madame Salvant goes through about throwing her the party as sort of a goodbye. Odette also reveals a lot less information than Bunny does in the novel, to the point where I'm not really sure she needed to be murdered, although she did have terminal cancer. The Myrna Harris parallel is named Josette here, and she is murdered. She was a work colleague of Alice, who blames herself for Josette's death. Alice got promoted to headline reporter in this episode, so she was trying to get a big scoop, and it winds up in resulting in Josette's murder. Alice does have time to save Harriet from being murdered. The Miss Murgatroyd of this version does survive. But there's an odd subplot here of Laurence falling for the new medical examiner. This is Dr. Euphrasie Malloy, who I mentioned earlier. This was a fine love story. It actually results in a better characterization for Laurence once Dr. Malloy was sort of out of the picture. Their romance was fine though, and what really sealed this episode's fate for me though is the very, very bizarre and quite frankly disgusting through line about Madame Salvant loving horses. This episode takes place on a stud farm for horses, and when I say she loves horses, I mean she loves horses, in the erotic sense, full-on equus here. She sleeps next to them in the stable. There's a very uncomfortable scene where she's erotically brushing a horse and basically molesting it. And then when she gets exposed as the murderer, she shoots the horse dead before turning the gun on herself. Extremely reminiscent of a certain pair of Christie lovers. It was disgusting. There's also a few graphic scenes where Harriet beheads a duck, and the Dr. Malloy is sawing open Odette. It's pretty graphic. It was unnecessary in my opinion, and further ruined what was already a pretty lackluster episode. The next episode thankfully gets us back on the right track. It's much, much better. It's called L'étrange enlèvement de Petit Bruno, or The Strange Kidnapping of Little Bruno, which is an adaptation of the short story The Adventure of Johnny Waverly. And I wish short stories got adapted a lot more often, especially from this series. I mean, this series literally ended and moved on to the third iteration because the show ran out of stories they could get the rights for. But they do allow for the best of both worlds, these short stories. Filmmakers can keep the original plots intact, satisfying the purists, but also allow some expansion and creativity to fill out the time. And that is exactly what this adaptation does. The plot is mostly the same, but there's a lot of new content that fits very well and seamlessly. I enjoy this adaptation a lot. There is a murder in this version that does feel a little shoehorned in there, but it seemed like they had to have a murder. It's not really that bad. It didn't hurt the episode. I just found the episode to be much better than the last few, and I really enjoyed it. This got the show back on the right track for me. And this is not a story that's like particularly popular or gets told very often, so it was nice to see it. The next episode is Le Cheval Pâle, or The Pale Horse, and to me, this was the best episode of season 2, and we finally get a good adaptation of The Pale Horse. Up until this point, The Pale Horse has had a bunch of adaptations, and none of them good. Technically, this is technically pre-Sarah Phelps' slaughter of the book, but and this was an excellent episode. It's not only faithful to the novel, but it fixes a few of the issues. I thought this was fantastic. The Father Gorman character, Père Francois, goes directly to Laurence with the list of names, although he doesn't believe him. And, one of the names that winds up on the list is Francine Marshall, the Thomasina Tuckerton parallel, who is a friend of Alice. Francine does die eventually, but she lasts a lot longer than Tommy does, and it's made pretty clear to the audience she's being murdered and her stepmother has something to do with it. That's not something that's hidden from us, and there is no pale horse actually. Instead, the occult women have a tent at a creepy carnival, and there are only 2 women, not 3. The pale horse is the passphrase for prospective clients, and I thought it was very well incorporated. Marlene actually visits Sybil and Irene, that's the 2 women, for a love potion to make Laurence fall in love with her. Eugene DaCosta, who is the Mr. Venables equivalent, is a far more plausible suspect here. He actually owns the carnival and knows Sybil and Irene. And he has MS, but is able to move around a little more than in the novel, so he becomes a much more viable suspect. The killer is caught in the same way, with Laurence pretending he wants to kill Alice, or maybe not pretending, but anyway, so he can marry Marlene, which Marlene is just head over heels with. And I think what makes this version so good is that we don't have, like, the Mark Easterbrook or the Ginger Corrigan or the Hermia, who really aren't that interesting. And the main TV characters taking over all of those roles really improves it quite a bit. And it's very faithful. And it plays up, of course, the spooky, eerie tone of the novel, but it doesn't go too far. I thought this was the best episode of these 27. The next 2 episodes do dip a little bit, again, before the series gets better again. This next episode is L'Affaire Prétereau, and I hated this episode. This was an episode of Murder at the Vicarage, and while other episodes, significantly change the setting, for time and place, they do it in a way that's interesting and works. And I just didn't think this was interesting. I actually think this is a worse version of Murder at the Vicarage than the Geraldine McEwen one. Now, this episode is watchable on its own. Like, it works on its own as an adaptation, but it doesn't work as an adaptation of Murder at the Vicarage. And I think part of the problem is that because France is predominantly Catholic, there's no vicarages. So what the show did was move the action to an ad agency. And this episode was very Mad Men inspired. All the very basic plot of Murder at the Vicarage is there, but it's very slight, and it takes forever to get there. It actually begins with an entirely new murder of one of Prétereau's secretaries who was raped. There are some unpleasant jokes about rape and sexual assault that were in poor taste. Nothing with this secretary character made any sense. I don't know why it was there. She was engaged to Damien, who is a new character. I actually think Damien is it's supposed to be based on Prétereau's chauffeur, who's having a relationship with Mrs. Price Ridley's maid in the novel, I guess. I don't know why they were so prominent here. And there was a side plot involving Alice and Damien, since they were friends from the orphanage, and Marlene becomes a spokesmodel for a photocopier, which this was actually the best part of the episode for me, was all the stuff with Marlene. I mean, this photocopier is just humongous, and it could make 7 copies in 1 hour, which doesn't seem like a lot, but you know what? My photocopier is probably worse. And I really just did not like this episode, although it was perfectly watchable. I mean, this does survive the adaptation test I have, that it could stand alone without having to have, read the book. But I just simply did not like the creative decisions that were made here. The product isn't bad. It's not boring. It goes by quickly, but again, this just did not do it for me. Yeah, much the same feelings for the next episode, Le Mystérieux Affaire de Styles, which I thought was pretty bad, and I actually think this is the worst episode of the season. Whereas the Murder of the Vicarage episode still like worked on its own, this one did not. I got not gonna lie here, I got Sarah Phelps vibes from this episode. It was very strange. First of all, Styles is now a health resort spa where very weird things happened. Just a lot of the flavor of the novel was gone. Usually the series keeps the framework and puts a whole new spin on it, but the framework here was also largely gone. Most of the characters from the novel are missing, except for Emily, Inglethorpe, Alfred, and Evie. Everyone else is a new character. I think they did do some interesting things with the murder plot, like trying to keep the basis of it, but it's a plot that just like doesn't work in the late 1950s. And I liked what they did with that, but everything else was just kind of bad and weird. I mean, there's another murder that occurs before the murder of Emily Beauregard, who would be Emily Inglethorpe. Emily is obsessed with preventing aging, and she has a habit of drinking the blood of young children. Yes. Emily is also Alice's mother, who left her at the orphanage, and she winds up dying in Alice's arms after they reconcile. The plot was just weird and all over the place. It didn't have the spirit of the Mysterious Affair style. I thought this one was pretty bad all around. Probably the worst episode of the season for me, and I don't think it's honestly particularly close either. The next episode was Albert Major Parle Trop, or Albert Major Talks Too Much, which is an adaptation of A Caribbean Mystery. And this one was good. We are now on the upswing, and we don't have a really bad episode ever again. And this is a good example of the series taking the bare bones of the plot and most of the characters and putting them in an entirely new setting, and it's making it fresh, and it's making it work. And the action takes place primarily in a hospital where Alice is recovering from riding a scooter with Marlene. Her file gets swapped with another patient, so Laurence and Marlene think Alice is dying of cancer. And Albert Major is our Major Palgrave, and he's a crime writer, and he doesn't really talk all that much, to be honest. The title is a bit odd, though it's the French title of the book. But Alice actually wants to talk to him, and he gets murdered very quickly. A lot of the plot is actually intact, despite the markedly different setting. There is a new subplot about harvesting organs for heart transplants that actually does feature into the motive a little bit. Heart transplants are not a thing yet at this time, so there's a race to be the first to do it. The characters from the novel are all either now doctors or patients, and this episode fixed some of the issues with the novel. Again, I'm going to spoil the episode a little bit here and the book, so skip ahead if you need to, but there's a fun little Easter egg in here that most of the characters have similar names to the book, which is usually not the case, but the two who don't are Molly and Tim Kendall, who are now Danny and Paul Curel. And what Albert Major knows about Paul is basically the plot of the novel, in that he saved his wife from suicide and then murdered her when they were on vacation in the Caribbean. So I thought this episode serves as like a little fun little sequel into which Paul moves on to the next rich woman to murder her. I thought it was very well executed. I liked this episode a lot. The next episode I thought was also pretty good. It was an adaptation of The Man in the Brown Suit called L'Homme au Complet Marron, and this is somewhat faithful to the original. At least what the series did here is they took the murder at Millhouse and the murder at the train station and used that for the basis of the episode. There's no Kilmorden Castle, there's no ship, there's no safari. It's just like the beginning part of The Man in the Brown Suit that was adapted. And the theme has been changed to a more like Cold War espionage, but it's still that mix of mystery and adventure. But the highlight is Inspector Laurence going undercover as a female secretary named Brigitte, and he has to get lessons on being a woman and a secretary for Marlene. And this is, of course, played for jokes, as like Elise, at least for a while, doesn't recognize him, which was ridiculous. I mean, it was very clearly Inspector Laurence as Brigitte, but this also does serve for a bit softening of his character, because from this point forward, he's a lot less chauvinistic, Inspector Laurence, because he's been a woman and he's been groped, and like a lot of the men are attracted to him. Like a Tricard like gropes him in the car at one point, so he has a better understanding of what it's like to be a woman, and it sort of does soften him a little bit. But much of the action takes place in an opera house, which is an expansion of the beginning of the novel. I really enjoyed this episode. I was sort of bothered here that some of the characters' names were mixed up from the novel. I mean, there is a Nadine in this version, but she's not the Nadine from the novel. That Nadine is now Tatiana Pochenko. And the Guy Paget character is named Eustache instead of the Sir Eustace character who was named Alexandre Latour. I don't hold that against this adaptation, but it is something that just like bothered me a little bit. And some of the characters were cut, of course. Alice takes over a lot of what Anne Benningfeld does. My one little knock against it is that I felt like the man in the brown suit mystery, like the idea of who is the man in the brown suit, just like wasn't as interesting here. Probably because it felt like almost like an afterthought, but there wasn't a lot of talk of that for my personal liking. But overall, this was a very strong episode. The next episode is called La Miroir se brisa, The Mirror Cracked, and this was a fantastic episode. I really love what the show did here. This is remarkably faithful plot-wise, while improving every issue I have with the original. And it's not alone in that. Like, the Joan Hickson version did the same thing. In fact, I think this episode is more or less an adaptation of the Joan Hickson version, more so than the actual book. And to be honest, I actually think this is better. I mean, the plot of this novel is very thin and easy to solve. And this episode makes the mystery more intriguing and harder to solve. The German measles stuff isn't mentioned until much, much later, so it's not at all obvious why Simone was murdered. That's the Heather Badcock character. Simone does not have a husband, but an adult son. And there's no painting of the Madonna and Child, nor is the Lady of Shalott mentioned. Simone is a hairdresser who is substituting in for Blanche, that's Marina Gregg, as a hand model. And a lot of action takes place on the film set. There's no Ella, but her murder is kept and is given to a doctor named Menchikov, who is Blanche's personal doctor. He is the creator of Calmot, which is a drug that contains marijuana. It's also in liquid form, which makes the murder possible to pull off. In the novel, Calmot is in the form of pills, which actually is full of plot holes, since the first murder really should not have been able to been pulled off. But I know I just felt the emotions of this episode were excellent. Laurence is mourning the loss of Dr. Malloy, the former medical examiner, after she dies in a plane crash, and he basically can't even function. And Alice starts a lesbian relationship with Frederic, who is the Margot Bentz parallel. This relationship is well done. It's not over the top or ridiculous. This isn't ITV Marple Land. It's Alice and Marlene who do a lot of the collecting of evidence because Laurence is just totally out of it. I thought this was a truly spectacular episode. It adapted the novel well and made changes that were necessary. I thought the three leads here were excellent. I thought the changes kept up the spirit of the novel and served to correct issues. I think my one, very small knock against it is that I thought the actress who played Blanche, that's the Marina Gregg character, was overly campy at times. I thought there were times when I thought she was fantastic, and other times when I thought her performance was just so over the top. And she doesn't have that good shocked face moment. You know, the one that I'm talking about from the novel where, she's looking at the painting. It just wasn't as good here, and I think partly is because the show's trying to hide that, because it does make it kind of obvious, but, she just wasn't consistent, and it's unfortunate because Marina Gregg / Blanche Duloc is one of those few Agatha Christie characters that I think has so much potential for a performer in that role. And I did think the actress, she didn't flop, but I thought she was very inconsistent. The next episode is called Crime Haute Couture, or Crimes of High Fashion, and is an adaptation of Third Girl. I thought this was pretty good. I don't think it is at all an all-time great adaptation, but it was very strong. As you might have guessed from the title, the action takes place primarily in a fashion house run by Edouard Paget, who is the Andrew Restorick character. This episode was a little confusing because most of the characters from the book are there, but again, they're sort of mixed up in the roles they play. The episode plot makes sense. I mean, for example, there is a Louise Charpentier under that same name, but she basically swaps deaths with the David Baker character, who's now named Paco Gomez. It's Paco whom Patty Nollet, or Norma Restorick parallel, thinks she murders, and then is caught red-handed, in air quotes, murdering Louise in the same way this happened to David in the book. There's actually another murder in between those two that's closer to the Louise murder from the book. A lot of the plot is cleaned up for the better. We don't have any weird, like, swapping places, disguises, impersonations, and the likes. And all the other pieces of the plot are there. And I have a very, like, odd criticism here, but I actually found the three lead characters to be a little bland in this episode. I mean, Marlene was pretty unlikable here, and I think that's intentional. Like, she becomes a model for Paget, and Elise becomes a seamstress and unionizes the workers, but I found Elise was severely underutilized, and Laurence was merely fine. Like, he felt a bit flat for me. It was just very odd for the series, because overall, the three leads excel in every episode, but again, not so much here, but overall, pretty strong adaptation, I thought. The next episode is La Crime de Noël, and this isn't an adaptation of anything. This is one of two episodes in season 2 that is not based on a Christie novel, and this episode was fantastic. I really loved this episode. It was truly wonderful. Now, it does have the benefit of me not having an original work to compare it to, but this episode takes place on December 23rd through 25th, Christmas Day. It borrows a very small amount from Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which the show already adapted as a precursor to the series in Petits Meurtres en Famille, and would later adopt probably just 2 episodes after this one. But this is a very well done mystery, both mechanics-wise and emotionally. It takes place predominantly at Sainte-Cécile Orphanage, which is the orphanage Alice lived in as a child, and she relives her traumatic experiences and miserable Christmases. Now, she works as a teacher at the orphanage when the real teacher doesn't show up. She hates Christmas, as does Laurence, who is our Grinch of the episode. And, of course, Marlene loves Christmas. We have a few victims. Our first victim is a man who looks and acts like Santa Claus, and he's murdered in front of 2 orphans, Baptiste and Louison, with Baptiste being kidnapped by the murderer shortly afterward. Sylvie, a maid at the orphanage, is murdered in very much the same circumstances as Louise does from Death on the Nile. That's another, thing I noticed from another Christie novel, but this was an extremely heartfelt episode. A little cheesy, a little over top of the much over how heartwarming it was, but I really enjoyed Elise coming to terms with her childhood, and Laurence having to care for Louison, and Marlene trying to sing, what she does very poorly. It was a very nice episode. The next episode was Drame en trois actes, or 3-act tragedy, which I thought was a mixed bag, mostly good, but there were a few things that bothered me in minor ways, but enough to matter. Our Sir Charles character is Herbert Michel, played by Samuel Labarthe. Labarthe is in a dual role here as Laurence and Herbert. The egg roll is split between Alice and Marlene. Marlene is pursued by Herbert, while Alice is pursued by Gregoire, who is the Oliver Manders character. Marlene actually plans to marry Herbert, which leads to this subplot of Laurence, Tricard, and Glissant coming up with these really ridiculous ways of stopping the wedding because they all love her. There's also a new secretary here introducing Arlette Carmoy, who is the exact opposite of Marlene. Again, this isn't the last we'll see of her. The plot actually is pretty faithful, mechanics-wise and motive-wise. I'm just going to get a little bit spoilery here for the novel and the episode, but I did not prefer that the first murder here wasn't random, which I thought was a pretty key part of the novel I would have liked to have seen kept. Now, they did play around with it a little bit because, the glass going to the character, originally Alice intercepts it, but she does hand it over. I always had problems with this plot mechanics-wise. It doesn't really make a lot of sense why the murderer would commit murders this way, but still, I think it's an important part of the novel. And Mrs. de Rushbridger here has a much bigger role. She is now Matcha Semenoff, who is a combination of Mrs. de Rushbridger and a certain other character whose existence I won't mention. I don't want to spoil the book, but if you read the book, you know who I'm talking about. And I didn't care for the Doctor Strange character, Richard Nobel, who is a theater director. He's gay, and it's played for laughs, and he's into some rather risque things, shall we say. And this felt totally unwarranted and just there to be the shock factor. I didn't need it. I don't think it was particularly well done. What was well done was the disguise and costuming clues. This is a very hard trick to adapt on the screen, and I thought the show did it wonderfully. So overall, I enjoyed this episode, but there were little hitches here and there. The next episode is Mort Unsold, Murder for Sale, which is an adaptation of Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which contains neither Hercule Poirot nor Christmas. I thought this was a fine adaptation. It was strange to me that the show chose to adapt this novel, considering they sort of already did. I mean, the precursor to the series, Petits Meurtres en Famille, was a 6-episode miniseries adaptation of this novel, and featured the season 1 characters. I thought this episode was fine. It keeps a lot of the plot mechanics and mostly focuses on the Pilar stuff. Pilar is named Francesca, and she's Italian, but has the same backstory. The Simeon Lee character is named Simon Krebs, and he only has 2 sons. He has Albert, who is a combination of George and Alfred, and David, who is a combination of David and Harry. There are no wives other than Krebs' wife, Elizabeth. She is alive here. And the paternity subplot is still present, but this time it doesn't involve Krebs. It involves Inspector Laurence when he learns he has an illegitimate son named Thierry, played by Samuel Labarthe's real-life son Alexandre, who is the Horbury parallel. Thierry works in a department store owned by Krebs. And I actually like the department store setting. It's an underrated classic in detective fiction and brought such great novels as The French Powder Mystery by Ellery Queen and Death in High Heels by Christiana Brand. There's a subplot here involving Alice becoming a salesgirl this time after she came down with amnesia, and Marlene being very upset about the death of Marilyn Monroe. I thought this was a solid episode, but one that's probably not going to stick with me in the long run. The next episode was Melody Mortelle, A Deadly Melody, which is an adaptation of the Sitterford mystery. And again, I use the word adaptation very loosely here. There is more Sitterford mystery in this episode than in the ITV Marple version, but not by much, to be honest. There is a seance, and that's about it. But, I mean, this episode was fine on its own. I mean, most of the action takes place in the world of rock music, where Alice has now somehow managed to get herself a gig as an international rock star named Shirley. Laurence is haunted by the ghost of Dr. Malloy, the former medical examiner who died a few episodes back. I think this episode is very good on its own. It's not a good adaptation of the Sitterford mystery, and quite frankly, I never would have known that's what this book was supposed to be adapted here had the credits not told me that. It's missing a lot of the key elements of the original. There's no snow, there's no ridiculous surplus of baffling side plots, there's no escaped convict from Dartmoor, there's no football sweepstakes. I was disappointed they didn't keep that because at the very beginning, there's a throwaway reference to a lottery ticket that I thought would play a part here, but again, that was just an Easter egg. And like I said, I thought this was a fine episode, but not a fine adaptation of the original, although somehow this is the most faithful adaptation of a Sitterford mystery in existence. Somehow. Now, to be fair, I have not watched the Hindi miniseries Charlie Chopra and the Mystery of Solong Valley, which is based on this novel, so maybe that's more faithful. I'll get there eventually, though I don't suspect it's more faithful than this one. The next episode is called Ding Dong Dong, an adaptation of Evil Under the Sun. And this was a pretty good episode, I thought, except for one significant issue, and that's that mental health issues in this episode are treated repeatedly as punchlines in a way that I found extremely distasteful. There's no island resort here. Instead, the Jolly Roger is now the Lille Clinique mental health institution where Marlene is a patient. Marlene had a breakdown that I did not find very convincing. Laurence later pretends to go insane in order to get committed. That wasn't great. Alice becomes a nurse and just lies about her experience. No one checks. There was a patient there who has a mental health issue where he gropes women all the time, and that's depicted for laughs. It's actually the Reverend Lane character. But other than that major issue, I thought this episode was pretty good. All of the pieces of the novel are present. The murder location is a bit different. It's an outcropping in the woods near the clinic, so there's no need to inquire about who's afraid of heights and all that. One of the complaints I have about this book is that the timeline is just so tight. It does border on the impossible to pull off. So by making the location where Clarice's body, that would be Arlena, closer to the main building, eliminates that sort of ridiculousness. There's a subplot involving the return of Arlette Camoui, who was Marlene's replacement a few episodes back. She's now a police officer and tries to get Laurence arrested for the murder because he was sleeping with Clarice, because of course he was. And I was sort of under the impression she did it on purpose because she sort of like twists something Marlene said out of context, but I think she was just simply overzealous in her work. I did have a problem with some of the characters. I thought like Clarice was far less nuanced than Arlena, and the murderers were not that interesting. It was also sort of weird to me how everyone kept talking about Dr. Rodier, that would be the Kenneth Marshall parallel, and they were talking about him as if he were ugly, which he was like a tall, dark, handsome actor portraying him. And meanwhile, they're talking about Patrick Redfern character. His name was Nathan Stenner, as if he was some sort of like Greek god, but he was kind of nerdy and he had these big glasses. Like I just thought it was really weird the way they were talking about him. But this episode had a number of issues, and particularly a glaring one. But overall, it was faithful and it did a very good job. I thought it was still watchable. The next episode is called L'heure zero, or Toward Zero, and I found this to be a very good episode. Again, it kept the framework and the characters mostly faithful and gave the story a whole new setting. This time in a TV studio where Audrey Fontaine, that would be Audrey Strange, is the new lead anchor. Claire Beaumont, who is the Kay Strange character, is an announcer, while Maxime Beaumont, that's Neville, is a celebrity chef. And Alice once again quits her job at the newspaper, and now she's an assistant to Maxime. Obviously, there's no talk about having like late murders. In fact, there's a pretty early murder that isn't in the book. And the idea of all these people leading separate lives converging at one place and one event affecting them all isn't directly mentioned, but there is a lot to that effect. I mean, mostly involving relationship breakups. Maxime, again, that's Neville, actually dumped Marlene a long time ago for Audrey. Laurence had a relationship with Audrey and she dumped him. And Audrey still had that relationship with the Adrian Royd character. He's not named here. And we do have confirmation that that person was murdered. That was one of the theories someone suggested I covered. And I wish I had seen this episode before I did that. I would have mentioned it. But Dr. Glissant is upset with Marlene because she betrayed him. There's the whole subplot involving Marlene trying to frame Maxime as a revenge for dumping her before her wedding day. And she does a good job of that, as good of a job as like Hastings does trying to murder Major Allerton and Curtin. So, in other words, just very bad. But this was an excellent episode. I do wish I had more of like the themes of Toward Zero, but overall, it was spectacular. Very good. The penultimate episode is called Rendezvous avec la mort, or Rendezvous with Death, which is Appointment with Death. And we actually have a good adaptation of this novel here. I mean, the Suchet version is an absolute abomination, and the Ustinov one, I think, is easily the worst Ustinov film. So I was happy to have this episode. And it's very faithful to the book, except the action is in Lille and not Petra. A lot of the side characters, like Dr. Gerard, got cut, but it keeps the iconic lines. You do see that she's got to be killed, and I never forget a face. Mrs. Boynton here is actually Tricard's sister, Clemence Berg, and she's even worse than she is in the book, and she lives for quite a while. There's actually another murder before hers of her maid, and I thought the actress who played her, Mireille Herbstmeyer, was fantastic. I mean, she was so evil, it was remarkable. It was chilling. And this episode also incorporated parts of Christie's stage play as a red herring, which I thought was a nice touch. You know, if you know, you know. A lot of people, including myself, think the stage play ending is better than the novel, but here it's a red herring. I actually thought that's where this episode was going, but there's a side plot involving Alice, who takes over for the murdered maid, and she keeps seeing visions of various family members murdering their mother. Suzanne, who is the Geneva parallel, she's actually a combo of Ginny and Carol, is a lot younger here, and she was on the creepier side. I got like Wednesday Addams vibes from her, or really more specifically, I got Josephine from Crooked House, and she's obsessed with death, and she has like a toy guillotine. I really enjoyed this episode. It was very good. It did fix a few of the minor issues that I have with the book. And the final episode is called Un cadavre à petit déjeuner, or The Body at Breakfast. And this is not an adaptation of any Christie novel. I did get like minuscule amounts of The Body in the Library and Curtain, but what I really got was a lot of Anthony Barclay's Mr. Priestley's Problem, just because of how farcical this episode is. And it's a musical with original song and dance routines that I found delightful. You are not meant to take this episode seriously at all. And you could tell this episode was just something fun for the cast to send the show off at the end of this 7-year run before the next iteration begins. There is a mystery where Alice wakes up next to the murdered body of her boyfriend, and everyone just gets dragged into this ridiculous cover-up while trying to solve everything. Like Inspector Laurence is leaving France to join the FBI in Washington, and he did not tell Alice or Marlene, but they find out and are very upset by this. Laurence is uncharacteristically nice to Alice in this episode, but the incoming inspector is played by none other than Antoine Dulery, who is now Maurice Leroy, the nephew of the inspector from the first season, played by the same actor. Again, this episode is just so much fun. I had a great time with it, and you could tell the cast did as well. I mean, this is just one of those episodes of television programs that's clearly been made just for the fun of it, rather than to be good. I enjoyed it. And yeah, the mystery was a little thin, but it did call back the original, Petits Meurtres en famille. I'll say no more than that. But the episode primarily focuses on all the recurring characters and their futures and their lives. It was a lot of fun. It was a very good send-off for the show. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think of Season 2 of Les Petits Meurtres. And I thought it was pretty good. Again, I had a lot of fun with it. I wish it lasted longer, but from what I understand, the reason why the show moved on to the third iteration was simply because the producers couldn't secure the rights to certain novels they wanted, so they were moving on to more original content. I mean, the third season, which, to be fair, I did watch and was not a fan of, did adapt The Hollow and Endless Night, though it's mostly original stories. Again, I think it's because the producers were pretty open about how they just couldn't get the rights to certain novels, so they just moved on, which is a shame. I mean, we had all those short stories, but I get it. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think of Les Petits Meurtres. And until next time, Mystery Files.